Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel here, and well, I'm back from my vacation. I'm happily married now to my lovely new wife, and I am back to regular uploads for the next foreseeable future. Now, here, with no further ado, I would like to once again shout out all my channel members. I really appreciate the contributions you guys make. You help make everything here possible. And if you guys would like to support the channel, by all means, go down into the link in the description below and join as a member. If you can't afford that, I understand today's trying times, and just do your regular YouTube things like share, subscribe, and comment below. But no further ado, let us begin. So, the most important thing I want to stress here, compared to the last forecast I had for British Columbia, is I actually changed a lot. A lot has been changed between these forecasts. Minor things, I updated my approximations for demographics like age, sex, education levels, incomes by riding, because the government of British Columbia officially posted the quote-unquote official values. So I updated those to all those. Not a big change. Most of them were pretty accurate, but some of them were a little off. Like, we're not talking like huge numbers off, but a little off in some cases. So I updated all of that. But the big thing I've changed is, well, I changed how I'm approximating the BC Conservative vote. And this is actually really hard to explain. So I'm not really going to explain exactly what I did. Just know that I changed it quite a lot. And what this really boils down to is, in essence, I've flattened out the BC Conservative support bands. So the rural areas, they are getting less dominant. But in the rural areas, the urban areas, they are more competitive. So what you're seeing is some places like Bulkley Stuykind up here or North Coast have flipped orange, but places like Vancouver Langara or parts of Surrey here, or all of Surrey, are reasonably more competitive. Because before, if you remember this, Surrey was all roughly this color. Actually, we do have the last map here. I'll just bring that up. So this is what it was before the last update. And you can really, side by side, see the differences here. Quite large. So much of urban Vancouver is no longer deeply safe. It's now actually reasonably, or a lot more reasonably competitive. Some places like Vancouver Chinchilla have flipped. Other places like Richmond and Delta have flipped the other way. So I think that this is a better show. We'll see come election day how much more accurate this is, if it is more accurate. It's really hard at this stage to really guess and really forecast this, because there's so many unknowns with the BC Conservatives. They could have any number of positions in support, and I think a lot of the models that are out there's all sorts these days, but like you look at like 338 Canada and stuff like that. So the bigger name ones, I think any approximations of the BC Conservatives are at least reasonable. Are they right? I don't know, but they're at least reasonable. Actually, 338 Canada has this rate quite a bit closer than I do, but, well, it is what it is. I'm skeptical, but we'll see. It could keep trending that way quite well. And now just to make this a little more clear too, so we have here trends. So May 20th was the last proper update I did. So since then, United's lost their last seat. They're skunked. Good job, Kevin Falcon. You played this one aces. BC Conservatives have lost a seat, and the NDP have gained 2. And these two seats were both gained in Vancouver proper, but there's also been some other, or the net seats were both in Vancouver proper, but there's also lots of other movement around. BC Conservatives have gained ground in Fraser Valley, but they've lost ground in the north and the south. North and Vancouver Island, And the south, they traded seats, but they ended up exactly where they were in total seat count. Popular vote, between the wave of polls near the end of June and these changes, we're seeing two big things. So, in essence, the BC Conservatives and the NDP shot up a decent amount from the rejiggering of the numbers. From my changes to how the BC Conservatives vote support were, that boosted them and the NDP, but it has hurt the United quite a bit. They are now polling just around 15% in my model. And that's likely going to keep falling pretty harshly because you look at some of the raw polls coming out, they're not great. Like we're looking at 10, 9, 11. Now, I think that range might be a bit pessimistic for now, but it's certainly trending in that direction. It's not good news. And we're also seeing a lot of polls putting this race pretty close. Some have it, the last Liaison poll and the last Main Street poll had it within 2%, both polls. So it is starting to get pretty close in some regards, but, well, you'll see. Now, getting into the main topics of the race. So we're really seeing here in the last 2 months, since the last update I made on this, is Ebby's tried to do a bunch of things. There's some housing announcement changes, a bunch of other small things like that too, but nothing is really changing anything. And that might surprise a lot of people that new announcements or new programs or new ideas aren't really changing the dynamics. But what it really boils down to is voters, in the summer at least, maybe aren't paying as much attention. But I think that's more of a cope excuse. I really think it really boils down more to, I think a lot of voters have already made up their minds. We are going into an election year. We're really probably less than 3 months from E-Day at the time of posting this video. So it seems very likely that a lot of voters have already decided. And the final movements that we're going to see for the rest of this year, I think, are really going to boil down to United vote share. And where does that go? Where does that lead? And I think it's reasonably likely we'll continue to see the Conservatives gain ground. I think possibly the 38-37% range that we're seeing in some of the telephone polls, or the IVR polls, is probably accurate. We're probably going to see it somewhere around there. But at the same token, I don't think we're going to see the NDP vote share fall much below 39. Especially if the BC United keeps falling. Because at this stage, at about 15%, based off of, this is an old poll now, but there's an old Abacus poll back in May. And that poll suggested that roughly half of the remaining BC United voters were federal Liberal and half are federal Conservative. And I think push come to shove, that will mostly break 50-50. They'll flee NDP, they'll flee Conservative. Now, I think you could possibly make the case that more United voters will flee to Conservative than United voters will flee to the NDP this cycle. The BC's not quite into a stable two-party system yet after the collapse of United. But come 28, it probably will look like that. We're probably looking at both parties getting in the above 40% range as a result. So what I think seems likely to me is that the NDP will probably sit around where they are right now. Maybe let's say, generous and say they'll go up to 40%. And the Conservatives will gain 5%, maybe 5.5%. Let's say they'll go to 39. Be 40 to 39. Let's say that's the final result. Unfortunately, that's still a loss for the Conservatives. Now, I don't think it's that unreasonable to say that a loss like that you could describe as anything but a Pyrrhic victory for the NDP, and actually a very valiant and or smashing result for the BC Conservatives. They went from 0 seats in 2020 to official opposition in the realm of likely, if it's 40 to 39, roughly in the realm of 40, 45 seats. Like, to give you an idea, like if we're looking at that kind of range, you're seeing much of these ridings like Delta, Surrey South, Richmond's, Vancouver, Yaletown, that's 5 right there. You're probably going to see, I'm forgetting the name of this riding, but that riding there, North Coast, the rest of the Kootenays, etc. You could start seeing all those flip. And if you just see those 9 ridings I pointed to flip, you're at 42 to 50. Now, that's a comfortable win for the NDP, but it's a much reduced win, and it's a crushed win. It is a big gain for the BC Conservatives, and it puts them in a very strong position to challenge in 28. And let's not forget, it's not impossible at 40 to 39, and that's where the trend continues, that the BC Conservatives could win. Based on my modeling, which I don't have listed here, but my other modeling I've done in the past, for my own personal curiosity, the BC Conservatives need to win roughly, with the current distribution of votes. I'll pull this up just to be clear. So with this ratio of support by region, they need to roughly get, give or take, a 1.5% lead provincially to win. So if the NDP are at 40%, they need to be at 41.5%. The NDP are at 38%, they need to be roughly 39.5%, somewhere in that range. And if that happens, they win. And actually, once you start getting in the Conservatives are leading the popular vote, especially based on in the range similar to what we saw with Palace, Yorkville strategies and Main Street polls in April and May. That kind of range gives us in a position where a lot of uncertainty happens, a lot of chaos can happen. The difference between the Conservatives at +1 to +1.5, that range is quite large. It swings from 40 seats for the Conservatives to over 50 in half a percentage point on popular vote lead. It can go from places like Vancouver and Langara flipping to places like Bulkley Stuykind flipping or Nanaimo flipping. A lot of plays here. There's about, from what I can count here, about 18 ridings across the province from Stuykind, Nanaimo, parts of Vancouver Island, and a lot of these outskirts of Vancouver ridings, including some central ones. There's about 18 ridings that I think are reasonably competitive for the BC Conservatives. 51 seats seems like they're soft ceiling this cycle. I'm not saying it's impossible to do better, but it seems likely they won't do better than that. So with that being the rough soft ceiling, that's really where the election is about. Can they hit that? And at this stage, it's hard to say. The reason it's hard to say is because, well, all the campaigns are kind of in hibernation mode. No one wants to shoot their big shots just yet because they're saving them up for September, saving up for October, when the election proper starts. Right now, you're seeing nominations happen. You're seeing Abbey try to do his final things he can do as a prime minister or as the premier to try to rebuild support, garner support, strengthen support. And what we're really going to see is just this. Just some back and forth, some sniping. But nothing too dramatic. Nothing too crazy. Because there's no point in shooting anything just yet. No big attacks, probably. No big announcements, probably. Especially in the middle of the summer. And it's going to build up. And then you're going to see, likely, as soon as the campaign starts, I think you're going to see Rustad go hard fast. Because there's really only one chance he has at winning. He needs to seize the momentum and hold it. And that's easier said than done. He has a lot of momentum right now, but he's not in the precipice of winning. He's in the room of winning, you could say, but he's not there yet. There's a lot of things he needs to get done. However, regardless of whether he wins or loses this election, it's pretty clear what this says. And it's a really good illustrative example to the rest of Canada and the rest of the world if they cared to look. And it's not a lesson we haven't learned before. It's not a new lesson. It's the same lesson parties keep learning time and again across the West right now. You look at Sweden, you look at Finland, you look at Italy, you even look at France or the UK. The same lesson keeps popping up. The Netherlands is another good recent example. And what is this lesson? The lesson is the right in a democracy needs unity to win. The quote-unquote far right and quote-unquote center right need to work out their differences. And I say quote-unquote because most people use far right to refer to like a fascistic party, and there's essentially no parties like that in the West. It's kind of silly to say that, but for clarity, a lot of media organizations call them quote-unquote far right parties. These two factions need to work together. They need to come to an entente, some form of agreement. The mistake Falcon made in BC is he tried to expunge the quote-unquote right from his party. He wanted to keep it as a center-right party. He didn't like the more socially conservative things. He didn't like the more right-wing opinions, such as on climate change. He got rid of them. The party leadership disallowed people like Aaron Gunn or John Rustad, just to name two. Rustad was kicked out of the party, obviously, and Aaron Gunn was disallowed from running. Other members, like Bruce Bannon, felt isolated and obviously crossed the floor. So there's lots of examples of this, where Falcon's leadership was really trying to stay center-right at all costs. He was disavowing the right. He was disavowing the center by trying to change the Liberal name to United, throwing away brand and history to try to score some political points, I suppose. But then if we look at all of these examples across Europe of recent elections, in the places where the right wins elections are places like Sweden or Finland or Italy or the Netherlands, where the hard right factions and the center right factions work together. They come up with a platform that both sides are comfortable with. In Italy, you have the Brothers of Italy and Forza Italy working together. In Sweden, you have the Moderate Party, the Swedish Democrats. And there's other examples too. I just don't know all the names of all the parties off the top of my head. And then we have negative examples, such as the UK or France recently. In the UK, the Tories and Reform, the centre-right and the right, didn't get along. And it's, again, usually the center-right that causes this disagreement. And they didn't get along, so they couldn't work together. and thus Labour wins. Though you could also argue that at this point Labour is more centre-right than the Tories have been the last 15 years, which is kind of sad because it really shows how skewed the UK political spectrum is, because I wouldn't describe Labour as a right-wing party normally. It's just in the UK, they are more right-wing than the Tories have governed, but that's another video altogether. And then in France, final interesting example here, the centre-right and the right couldn't work together. There's an attempt for them to work together with Eric Ciotti, but a lot of the members of Les Républicains, like Valérie Pécresse, didn't want to work with them. And by them, I mean specifically Le Pen. It's very likely in the case of France that Le Pen's just too toxic of a brand and needs to be replaced by someone else for any kind of cooperation to work, because it has to go both ways. The right can't run roughshod over the center-right, and the center-right can't run roughshod over the right. They need to work together, or they do not function as a party. They do not win elections. It doesn't happen. And the reason for this has to do with things I've illustrated time and again on this channel. The right is hierarchical. There are various lieutenants who run various factions, either formally or informally, and they all group together, in theory, behind a leader who should unite all the different lieutenants together and present a clear strategy. That's what Poilievre's doing. That's what a lot of these European countries that have seen successful right-wing parties take power have done. The places where this fails are places where the lieutenants are too bickering, or that the united leader doesn't unite properly. And that's the issue that Kevin Falcon had. And that's exactly why the BC United collapsed. His party is going to 0 seats, not just because of the name change, not just because he kicked out Rustad. It's going to 0 seats, genuinely 0 seats. I'm not the only model that has forecast them with 0 seats. Actually, I'm pretty sure 338 also has 0 seats, and I know several other modelers who have 0 seats for the United Party. And this all boils down to Falcon wanted to excise the right completely. He did not want them in his party. He did not want to work with them. He wanted to be just a center-right party. He wanted to get rid of the right. It doesn't work. You can't do it. We should have learned this lesson back, or Canadian parties should have already had learned this lesson back in 2012 in Alberta, 2015 in Alberta, 2022 in Alberta, 3 times in a row in Alberta. We might even see it again, depending on how people in Alberta feel. Danielle Smith's leadership review goes. We also saw it again in 2004, federally, in 1993, federally. Elections where the Conservatives lost because they weren't united. They disagreed on policies, they were bickering, squabbling, the lieutenants didn't get themselves rallied, the leader wasn't agreeable yet. Or factions felt not listened to or ignored. And this will keep happening time and time again. You could even say for a while in New Brunswick this was happening between the People's Alliance and the PC Party, though that might be more fixed nowadays, so it's harder to say. There's not a lot of polling in New Brunswick. The only firm that actually regularly fields in New Brunswick isn't a very good firm. At least historically hasn't been a very good firm. So where does that leave us here? Well, this is a shining example that the right can't win unless both factions work together. And to work together, they can't run roughshod over each other. And what does that mean? That means in Canada terms, the quote-unquote right is usually socially conservative, and the quote-unquote center-right is usually socially moderate and fiscally conservative. And the socially conservative faction doesn't usually care that much about fiscal policy. That's how it breaks down in Canada usually. A lot of times, actually, some of the social conservatives get called left-wing or socialist light because they don't care about fiscal policy at all. It's amusing. And what that means, though, is for your party to work together, the right-wing parties in Canada have to find issues that the social conservatives are concerned about, they're worried about, that they want action on, that the center-right is comfortable with, and do those. What we saw with Kevin Falcon is that there was no attempt at this. None at all. No arbitrage, no discussions, no attempts, which left the social conservatives isolated, alienated, and unmoored. They had no attachment to the party that did not want to do anything it wanted them to do. But at the same token, the center-right needs to rein, or wants the social conservatives reined in. They don't want drastic changes to social policy because they're moderates. They don't see it as a big priority. They're not that concerned about it, or they might even disagree with some of the things the social conservatives want to do. So they need a balance on that. But at the same token, the center-right cares a lot about fiscal policy. They need to get the fiscal policy that they are comfortable with, which usually means some form of small government, low tax sort of thing, which means the social conservatives have to accept a more conservative, quote-unquote, fiscally conservative fiscal policy. Possibly more fiscally conservative than they would like. And this is a compromise that has to be made every single election. And the job of the leader of a conservative party is to make sure both factions feel like they're getting their issues redressed. That there's a path forward. That even if this issue right now is being placed on the back burner, that there is a path forward one day. One day in the future, this can be addressed. It's not being shelved because it's verboten. It's being shelved for just immediate temporary political considerations. And that's the balancing act. And then I could extrapolate more on how this balancing act actually works and appeals to voters more broadly, and how it's actually useful for voters to see this, and voters want this, and all that stuff. But I think it's pretty clear where it is. If you just look at the United, and let's say you want to call 2/3 of United as the center-right, and 1/3 isn't, it'd be a very close election if the center-right and the right worked together. Will they? Not this cycle. And I'm not entirely sure if they will, at least in the way people think of that when I say work together. Because when I say that, people think, oh yes, merger. I don't think there's going to be a merger between the BC United and the BC Conservatives. It won't happen. Not with a result like this. And at this stage, Rustad and crew have to understand and know how to play the game. They need to redress to the center-right, but they cannot alienate the right in the process. And that's a tricky balancing act. And many a leader has failed this. if Rustad can actually manage this by the end of October, by election day, he might actually win this election. And I would probably put him down as one of the most successful leaders in Canadian history as long as he has a normal premiership, which is like 2-3 terms. That's a lot of at stake for Rustad. That's a lot of at stake for his party, because the danger you have with a party like the Conservatives is a lot of members of it want dramatic radical action. And I understand that. And that's not unreasonable, but it's not easy to do. Now, do not get this to me saying that you have to not do these dramatic radical things, but they have to be done in a manner that is comfortable to voters, that is comfortable to the center right, that is comfortable to moderates. You can't go in saying, speaking, talking, acting like someone who is strongly right wing and expect moderates to be comfortable electing you. That's not what the left does. You don't see Justin Trudeau acting like Jagmeet Singh, but he also does most of the things that Jagmeet Singh actually would do in government. Because Trudeau doesn't act like Singh. He doesn't act like big, hard radical. He acts like a moderate leader in a lot of ways. It's failing now because he's kind of screwed up the economy entirely. But if it wasn't for that, he'd probably be doing fine politically. That's the thing I'll touch on this when I do another Canada update, but that's the thing a lot of Conservatives in Canada need to understand. Trudeau isn't losing entirely because of Trudeau. Now, you could argue a lot of his policies have led to this, and I would agree with you. That's probably accurate. But if the roll of the dice and we didn't have COVID, he'd probably lose this next election. But it probably wouldn't be the decisive blowout it is. The fact that we had COVID when we had COVID has enabled this to be looking like a blowout election. And you could also probably say the same thing is true in BC here. The fact that we had COVID, that we had such an unprecedented crisis in our lifetimes, has allowed a lot of these dynamics that usually move at a glacial pace to move very quickly. Because a lot of the bad fiscal policy that chronic deficit spending governments do, chronically mismanaged economies do. Now, that I will caveat this, that BC is doing better than most of Canada, but there's still lots of problems in BC that are basically the exact same problems. And perhaps in 4 more years, it might look like other jurisdictions in Canada. Maybe it's just doing as well as it has because Horgan was actually a much better leader than Eby was. It's actually really unfortunate for BC that Horgan got cancer. He was a much better premier. But I digress. That's also unfortunate for John Horgan too that he got cancer. Though I think he's recovered at this stage. I haven't really followed it, but I hope he recovers. It's never good when someone has cancer. But to finish, the important thing right-wing leaders need, the important consideration they need to have, is in a lot of ways the same considerations you would expect from the aristocracy. The leadership needs to embrace their noble obligation for being in leadership. They can't be petty. They can't dismiss people's concerns. They can't pretend that someone is just going to vote for them just because they're the most right-wing person there. They won't. They'll stay home. They'll vote for someone else. They'll vote for a splinter party. They'll do anything else if you've lost their trust, if you've lost their confidence. That's the thing. That's the important thing. There's many, many reasons voters can do what they want. And the leader has to be humble enough to respect it, to expect it, to treat it accurately. That doesn't mean every single layperson who's shouting about crazy conspiracy theories needs to be treated as gospel. That, yes, the clouds are actually poison. No. But it does mean that if that person is talking to you, you have to be fair to them. You can't dismiss them outright. Humor them, in a sense. Though, don't. You have to play a balancing act between humoring them and playing into their delusions. That's not. I'm not saying you should just pretend that the chemtrails are real because someone talking to you thinks that. But there is tactful ways to interact with it. And a lot of what people like Kevin Falcon do is they think they're being tactful, but they're actually slapping not even that kind of fringe person in the face. They're slapping regular normie SoCons in the face. They're slapping regular normie conservatives in the face. But they think they're slapping fringe conspiracy theories in the face because they're out of touch on what the actual right wing looks like. They think that the right wing looks like their center right. And they think the center looks like the center right. So they think they're doing their job properly, but they're completely lost. And that's really the story of a lot of elections. The story of most right-wing defeats is this balance isn't made. And don't get me wrong when I say this. Just because one leader has made this balance and has threaded the needle does not mean that is now a solved problem. It will rear its head every time a new leader shows up, unless the leader can maintain that gravity. It's why in Canada, you can see every now and then, with the right leader in the right circumstances, the right can win massive blowout majorities. Diefenbaker, Mulroney, soon Poilievre. But then they can only sustain it for a couple years. Because it's a tough game to play. It's a tough balancing act. But that is the game of politics. And with that, I bid you adieu, and I will see you next week with something else.